Two Guys in the Dark.
My mother attended a Christian church during much of my childhood, but when we were away from church, she was involved in occult activities and had such of a strange sort of fascination with it that it seemed to take over her life. So much so that most memories of my mother involved the occult. We had a lot of demonic events take place in our home throughout my childhood. Back then I was told they were spirits of dead people and not demons, and I believed that until I was an adult. The events took place so often that they became almost a routine part of my life. Although I grew up going to church, my beliefs were like my mother's, which means that they did not align with the Bible. I believed whatever she taught me, so I believed in the existence of Jesus, and that there is sin, but that's about the only way my belief lined up with the Bible. As a result, I did not take it very seriously, and I remained that way for many years. My mother left our family when I was 10 years old, but the demonic entity stayed with us. When I was 12, I began experiencing what is commonly called sleep paralysis, although I didn't know there was such a thing at the time. My first experience took place in my childhood home. It was the middle of the night, and I was the only one sleeping on the second floor. I woke to the feeling of an evil presence in the room, but I couldn't see anything there. Invisible hands had grabbed my ankles and began slowly pulling me from my bed. I realized then that I couldn't move to fight back, so I closed my eyes and prayed Jesus for help. Immediately it had stopped, and the presence was gone. I didn't have another experience until 4 years later, when I was 16 and living with my mother yet again. This time I woke up because my bed was vibrating, and upon opening up my eyes, I saw a strange, shaggy-haired woman, short of stature, standing in my doorway and staring directly at me. When she moved forward, I realized that I couldn't move, so I closed my eyes and prayed in the name of Jesus, and it all had stopped. That was my last experience for more than a decade. Years had passed. I grew up, got married, and my husband and I really took an interest in the Bible and began to believe all of that stuff. It was at this time that the sleep paralysis experience started up yet again. But they became so common that I began to dread sleeping. I experienced several within 1 month, and it seemed to progressively get stronger and stranger, and sometimes even worse. The first time it happened in my adult years, I woke to a presence which climbed onto my body, caused such a strong pressure on my chest that I could barely breathe. I tried to scream, and couldn't. Then I tried to wake up my husband. It was then that I realized that I was paralyzed. I thought to pray, and then once I did, everything had stopped. I hadn't experienced anything like this in several years, so I was very disturbed that this even happened. It didn't seem like a dream to me, so I began researching online. I read about something called sleep paralysis. The definition that I read was all about hallucinations in the brain and did not involve anything spiritual. I read that the hallucinations are caused by the person panicking when they realize that they cannot move, but my experiences were the opposite. Each time I saw the so-called hallucination, when I tried to react, it was then that I realized that I could not move, not the other way around. None of it seemed right to me, but I didn't know what to think, so I just tried to ignore it. Then something happened again a few days later. I woke up to a strange feeling, like something was not right, and I could hear my husband in our living room speaking to our dog. I kept trying to call out to him, but my voice would only croak. I began to feel like something was trying to pull me through, not physically, out of my bedroom. Before I could even grasp what I was feeling, I popped up off the bed and was standing unsteadily in the doorway. Yet behind me, I was still lying in the bed. Before I could even think about how I was two places at once, I felt the pull once again. I began making my way to the living room where my husband was. Walking felt like bouncing, and I was so unsteady that I had to hold on to the walls. I felt like I had only partial control over my body. Whatever the pull was that wanted me to go to my husband, I could not control it. Finally, I rounded the corner, saw my husband sitting at his desk. I tried to speak to him, but he stared ahead at his computer monitor, as if he couldn't even hear me. I progressively got louder, but he didn't even notice. Finally, I had lost my balance and fell forward onto the floor. I remember hearing the smack of my hands hitting the tile. As I hit, my husband looked over at me, and he stared through me, ignoring my cries, and turned back to face his monitor. Each time I tried to stand, one of my legs would slide out from underneath me. I looked behind to see what was going on with my legs, and although I could see nothing but the room behind me, I knew there was something there holding on to my legs. It began pulling me back the way that I came. I tried to dig my fingers into the floor, but I kept on sliding. Then I remembered to pray. Suddenly I was back in bed where it all began. The strange feeling was gone. I yelled for my husband, and he came to me. At first he thought that it was just a nightmare. I hesitantly agreed with him, only because I didn't know how else to explain it. But when I explained it in more detail, including naming the things that he was sitting in front of him at the desk that he didn't have earlier in the day. Before I had gone to bed, his eyes had grew wide, and he confirmed to me that he indeed had been doing all of those things, and those objects were indeed on his desk. When I told him about falling and my hands slapping the ground, he seemed uneasy. He told me that he had heard a sound like something hitting the floor, but when he turned to look, he saw absolutely nothing, so he ignored it. He felt unsettled, and so did I. So he told me to come into the living room with him until we decided to go back to bed. When I walked in there, I noticed a piece of straw on the floor that the dog had tracked in from outside when I was asleep. According to my husband, and I felt frightened because I had seen that very same straw when I was sliding backwards during my experience, trying to cling onto the tile floors. I could not explain what happened to me that night, but I knew deep inside of me that it was not a nightmare. A few nights later, I woke up to an evil presence once again, but I prayed, and it was gone. After that, I woke to find my husband lying on top of me, behaving in a sexually aggressive manner that was not normal for him. I was shocked at his incredibly aggressive behavior, so I did not respond at first, except to stare at him in disbelief, trying to get a grasp on what had gotten into him. Then he leaned down, buried his face in my neck. I remember feeling his breath on my skin. I tried to move my head away from him in protest, but I could only fully move my eyes. And then that is when I saw my husband lying beside me in bed, still sleeping. I knew immediately that the sleeping husband was my true husband, so I suddenly became filled with terrible horror and tried to get away from the thing that was on top of me. But I couldn't move. I knew that I had to pray, and I did so. It was gone, and I woke my husband for comfort. A few nights later, I woke up to a presence at the end of my bed. I was so frightened that I didn't think to even pray, but instead closed my eyes so that I couldn't have to see what was there. Suddenly, I felt myself lift straight up from the bed. I slowly began turning in circles, faster and faster, unable to control what was happening. Finally, I was spinning so fast that I became dizzy and nauseated. When I didn't think that I could take it anymore, I remembered that I needed to pray, and immediately I was back on the bed. Nothing in the room was with me any longer, and I could finally move, but the dizziness persisted throughout the day. I began researching about the attacks once again. I found a website of sleep paralysis researcher who believed that these occurrences are actually demonic experiences. I decided to contact her for some advice. She wrote me back in a short amount of time and informed me that I have what is known as a generational curse because of my mother's involvement in the occult. Gave me a lot of information to help me realize what is happening to me and what I can do about it. I experienced more and more attacks. Eventually, I stopped fearing it, but grew to trust Jesus instead. When an attack began, I immediately prayed, and it went away. In return, my faith would grow even stronger. With the last attack, I woke to another presence right beside my bed. As soon as I noticed it, it came forward and ran its hand up my thigh in a sexual manner. I could not move. I was angry because I knew what was coming, so I tried to speak. And although I could only get my voice out in a harsh whisper, I said to it, "You have no power over me." Immediately it was gone, and I could move once again. After my 2 childhood experiences, These attacks started up again while I was a weak Christian, just beginning my walk. These attacks were strong enough to take control over me, but there is someone much stronger out there that I put my faith in to stop it. Because my prayers, they always stopped the attack. I became more faithful, and because I became more faithful, I no longer panicked during any of these attacks, but instead I knew to pray. Because I prayed immediately in faith, nothing could happen to me any longer without being stopped. I knew that it is the prayers that stopped the attack while it was ongoing, but I also believed that the attacks stopped for good because they could no longer really even begin. Because of my immediate prayers, I learned to trust God during all these attacks, rather than trying to fight them off by myself. He never once failed me when I prayed. He stopped every single attack faithfully, and now it has been 2 years with no more demonic experiences, including this phenomena called sleep paralysis. I used to suffer from a sleep condition called sleep paralysis, and sleep paralysis with hallucinations. My faith had healed me of this several years ago, and I'm thankful for it. I was about 15 the first time that I experienced it. I'd taken a nap on a couch on a lazy afternoon. When I woke up, I found myself unable to move a muscle. I thought that it was strange, but was not particularly alarmed. Eventually, I was able to move my index finger a little. Shortly after, the paralysis completely left. The whole experience lasted about 15 seconds. Over the next 4 years, such experiences would occur off and on, never lasting more than 30 seconds. It would usually occur just as I was about to wake up, or wake up and roll over. Only I could not roll over. Sometimes I could open up my eyes, sometimes I couldn't. Having no explanation for it, I simply learned to just live with it. One Saturday morning, it occurred as I was waking up. I tried to move my finger, as I had learned this helps to fully wake up. This time, however, a strange thing had happened. I seemed to roll out of my body. I got out of bed and walked down the hall and into the bathroom. I flipped on the light switch, but the lights did not come on. Then suddenly I was back in my room, awake but unable to move. Eventually I fully woke, got up, feeling very strange. For the first time in my life, I felt very uneasy about my experiences. I could hardly believe what had happened. I kept asking myself, did I just have an out-of-body experience? Did I just walk around the house with my body still in the bed? It was so surreal, and I could not find an explanation for it. Thereafter, such experiences would occasionally happen, always in the morning when the sun was up. Eventually, I learned to just live with it. Eventually, I even reached the point that when I tried to turn on the light and it did not come on, I would realize that I was out while my body was still in bed. One time I tried an experience in the midst of the experience. I decided to go outside, but after opening up the front door and stepping out, I was back in my parents' neighborhood, not my own. At that point, I was more in a dream state than an out-of-body state. There was a woman across the street. She noticed me, so I went up to go talk to her. Who she was or what she talked about, I just don't remember. Only that she seemed pretty familiar. Then I fell back into a deep sleep. So much for my experience, I thought. At the age of 19, my nightmares began. Nightmare seems like such an understatement, but it's the only word that I have. I'm not trying to be melodramatic, but there's no way to convey how truly frightening these experiences were. The first time was the worst. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up, unable to move. I then became acutely aware of the presence in my room. It was hovering above me at the foot of my bed. I sensed that it was full of fury and hatred, and it was directed right at me. Somehow I knew that it was an extremely malevolent spirit. The evil it radiated was beyond description. Being a Christian, the only thing that I could think of doing was to invoke the Lord's name. So in my mind I had shouted, "In the name of Jesus, demon be gone." Well, it didn't go away. I could feel that it was just laughing at me. Then it started to move closer to me. It ripped the covers right off my bed. I could feel its anger and hatred, and it was overpowering. Honestly thought that it was going to pick me up and drag me to hell. Somehow I was able to jump out of bed. I ran down the hall into my parents' room, screaming. I must have been experiencing an out-of-body again, because I was then back in my own bed. The being was still there, even angrier than before. Again it ripped the covers off of me and came at me. Again I jumped out of bed and ran down the hall into my parents' room. Again I was back in my own bed. Again. It was still there, full of anger. This happened a third time before I was finally able to wake up. It was over. I was covered with sweat, and my fists were clenched tightly around my bed sheets, grasping them at my neck. The entire experience had only lasted about 30 seconds, but it was the longest 30 seconds of my life. The next morning my parents never mentioned anything about it. Why would they? I had not woken them, and had not been physically in their room that night. It would be several years before I ever talked about this to anyone. I did not like thinking about it. I tried to just forget about it, and then push it out of my mind. Soon after, I was able to move out of my parents' house, and into my own apartment. I was hoping that my parents' house was haunted or something, and then after I moved, I would just be free. While my new place was just as haunted, and I continued to have such experiences, and even more frequently. Sometimes there would be one presence. Sometimes there would be a lot. Sometimes I could feel an intense pressure on my chest. It almost felt like something was trying to get in. Once I saw blood all over my arms. Sometimes I would have these experiences twice a week. Sometimes I would go months without one. It seemed random. The only constants was the presence or the presences were extremely evil and violent, and they hated me intensely. It was several years before I even mustered the courage to talk about this to anyone, but I had finally had enough. I talked about it with a Christian leader. We began to pray together. He even kept in touch with me for quite some time. After that, my attacks subsided substantially, but did not disappear completely. Finally, after 9 long years, at age 28, I got relief. Later on, it was revealed to me what was triggering all of these episodes. For reasons I don't need to expound here, I was often extremely depressed in my youth and would contemplate suicide. My fantasies of suicide sometimes even comforted me. I don't think I could have ever gone through with it because of my faith, but it did not feel good to fantasize about any of it. I would sometimes think of how upset people would feel after I was gone for not having been a better friend to me. I am now very remorseful about these fantasies, but at the same time, they felt good. Sometimes I would lie in bed for long times before going to bed, having thoughts towards myself with feelings of self-hatred and self-pity. As I recalled these times, it was as if a light bulb had suddenly went off in my head. On the very nights that I had wallowed in self-hatred, I would have these episodes. Why it took me 9 years to finally make this connection, I just don't know. What I do know, however, is that it was God who showed this to me. Through wallowing of self-hatred and contemplating suicide, it was opening doors for demonic attacks, inviting them to torture me, even though I did not realize it at the time. As soon as I understood this, I completely stopped fantasizing about it. It was a no-brainer. If all I had to do was be free, was to stop those fantasies, then of course I would. What a simple solution for a very complicated condition. Since that day, I have never again seen the demons in my sleep, and it is a wonderful feeling to get ready for bed knowing that I will sleep peacefully. After that, I would occasionally get depressed and have thoughts, and they might enter my mind. But as soon as they did, I would immediately push them out. I know what lies down that road, and I won't travel that again. One other thing that I need to mention is why on the first night I was not able to effectively rebuke the demon. This is how I now understand that it was him that revealed it to me. During my times of great self-hatred, instead of walking with Jesus, I was running away from him. I was actively and knowingly sinning, so obviously I couldn't get used to everything. Even though I still loved him, I had moved outside of his protection and unknowingly invited the demonic spirits. No wonder that demon laughed at me that first night. I probably seemed very humorous and pathetic to it. Nevertheless, even though I could not defeat it, I'm still protected. No physical harm has come to me during these nightmares, and I'm thankful for it. Once I stopped wanting to die, the nightmares had stopped. I finally got relief just before my breaking point. It was not until a few years later that I stumbled upon a website about sleep paralysis. I suddenly discovered that it is very common. Sleep paralysis with hallucinations is not nearly as common, but still fairly frequent. Learning that many people have been through very similar experiences was very therapeutic, and with that, my healing was almost complete. All that is needed now is for me to help others heal. I'm not claiming that everyone has thoughts about suicide, or has sleep disorders that will start the experiencing, or even sleep paralysis with hallucinations. I'm simply sharing my own experiences in humble obedience to God, so that one day my story can help somebody else. As early as 12 years old, I really thought that I knew everything that church had to offer me. I was born and raised in a Baptist family. We went to church every Sunday, prayed before every meal, discussed how good God was to us. Whenever I had a question about God or the Bible, my family would do their best to answer me. If they didn't have an answer, I'd be told the same thing every time. You just have to take it on faith. After 12 years of that, I came to the conclusion that I had reached the limit of answers that the Bible could provide for my questions. When it came to things such as the possible experience of aliens, the true identity of ghosts, or if magic was real, I knew that I had to take it on faith, whatever that meant. There was one question, however, that kept nagging at my 12-year-old mind. Why were my nightmares becoming real at night? Since before I could remember, I could have the same experience about once a week. I'd go to bed for the night, fall asleep, then wake up sometime later, completely unable to move. After a few seconds of confusion, the attacks would begin. This was when every experience was unique. Sometimes the attacks would only come in the form of a taunting voice. Other times I would see shadow people in my room. Other times, more physical beings would appear, and then become violent. It was an awaking nightmare that did not seem to have a solid answer. Beyond recognizing it as some sort of demonic activity, I was at a total loss. I remember the first time that an entity actually manipulated the physical environment of my room. I was 14 years old. At the time, I would always sleep with my door closed. I'd gone to bed for the night, and a few hours later, I had woken up paralyzed. It was late, so everyone else in the house was already in bed and asleep for the night. I was situated in a position where I was facing the closed door of my bedroom. It was not long before I began hearing sounds from the other side of the door. Thud, shuffle, thud. It sounded as if someone or something was making its way down the hallway towards my room. The noises stopped right at my door. For a brief moment, there was a silent pause. Suddenly the silence was broken by a creak of the doorknob turning. The door was pushed open. A dark figure slowly entered my room. The figure stood about 5 or 6 feet tall, was wearing some type of hooded cloak. Because of the hood, I did not get a good look at its face, but I was able to make out the silhouette. The outline of the face was all wrong. It wasn't human. It was the wrong shape. It appeared to be far larger than a normal human face, more reminiscent of a horse or a goat. Needless to say, I was horrified. It began shuffling over towards the bed, turned to face me. I was suddenly hit with a wave of what I can only describe as anger, hatred, and evil, yet it felt more physical. The being slowly reached into its cloak, pulled out something that looked like a knife or a dagger. It placed its hand on the bed, leaned over me, shifting all its weight onto the edge of the bed. I remember that I could actually feel the bed dip down to where it was leaning. That was when I realized that this was not purely spiritual. This being was physical. This being could manipulate the physical environment around it. This being could actually hurt me. It was at that moment I began frantically screaming in my head out. I was unable to physically speak, but my mind was going a mile a minute. I begged for God's protection, asked him to make this thing go away. As I prayed, the being drove the dagger into my side, dragged it through to the other, right over my stomach. I mentally braced myself as I waited for the pain to come. To my surprise, it never did. I only felt a slight tingle. Clearly the being was surprised by this as well. It pulled the dagger out of me, looked at the area over my stomach where the wound should have been, looked at the dagger, and then back at me. I was suddenly hit with another wave of anger, hatred, and evil, far stronger than the first. After that, the being turned around and shuffled out of the room. Once it was gone, I was finally able to move again. I checked the area where the dagger went in. There was no marks whatsoever. I must have been so frightened and exhausted by the experience that I had passed out, because the next thing I remember, I was waking up to the morning sun shining through my window. I listened for a moment, heard nothing but silence throughout the house, telling me that I was the first to wake up for the day. I looked over to my bedroom door and was horrified to discover that it was still open. That was the first time that I could no longer justify my experiences as nothing more than very intense and realistic nightmares. The being that had entered my room the night before left physical evidence of its presence. That experience of the cloaked being was my first of a physical manifestation, but it certainly was not my last. Sometimes they appeared as strange and disconfigured creatures. Sometimes they were just balls of light, or even shadows. Sometimes they would even appear as my friends or my family members. This was well before I was ever aware of the term familiar spirit. These manifestations and subsequent attacks mixed in with the lack of answers from my church that led me into an alternate route of my solution. My most notable and desperate attempt at a solution led to a New Age theology and the practice of astral projection. Needless to say, that only made the problem worse, and had almost ruined my life. It wasn't until I was a young adult that I learned the true power of Jesus. It wasn't until the rededication of my life and began operating in His authority that I could finally get a handle on the problem. It wasn't until I began reading the Bible again, outside the scope of tradition that I was brought up with, that I was finally able to understand what was happening to me. I began using the name of Jesus to command these entities to leave my house and my life. The truth was that I was missing all these years, due to the fact that I thought I knew everything about the Bible and what it had to teach me, was that the enemy has no real authority over us. The only power that it has is the power that we allow them. It is only by the authority power of Jesus, not on our will or our efforts, that we can remove these things from our lives forever.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.